Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Story, we ride the stories of the West campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind cut first. It came like a thin knife through the alley behind O'Hara's forge, catching on the crooked sign that read in black paint, already flaking noon brides and bonds. The forge's heat died on the anvil, and cold took whatever the fire left behind. A barrel hissed with old coals. Men crowded close and pretended not to shiver. May Harper stood with the other women by the wall, hands clasped in front of her coat. A burlap sack covered her head. The knot at the back had been pulled hard and double-tied. With every breath, the cloth dampened against her lips. It tasted like grain dust and old rope. Her shoulders locked. Her boots dug into trampled snow and ash. Silas Crane tapped his cane on a crate and smiled for the men. He was neat as his ledger book's hair, parted scarf tied just so. He lifted his voice so it slid along the alley. $3 to open. Look at that, boys. We saved you the trouble. Comes with the face already covered. A ripple of laughter moved along the circle. Someone whistled. Someone spit. May did not move. The rope fibers scratched where they brushed her cheek. The knot held tight. She tried to breathe in a way that did not show. Silas swung the cane and pointed in her direction. Her then. $3. Be quick or she freezes where she stands and I will have to sell her by the pound. Bootsteps broke the noise. Not quick, not slow, just steady. Leather on ice. A coat collar turned up against the cut of the wind. Eli Thatcher stepped into the circle of light from the forge door. There was black powder along one sleeve where he had leaned against a soot post somewhere. A strip of braided leather rode his wrist. At the center of the braid, a green stone caught a dull piece of firelight and went quiet again. $3, he said. Silas blinked, the joke still at the edge of his mouth. Serious Eli. I am, said Eli. He put 3 silver pieces on the crate. The coins clicked cleanly like something finished. Silas looked at the coins, looked at May, looked back at Eli, nodded. Fine. Cheapest wife in Silver Hollow. Take her before the wind does. No one laughed this time. Eli turned to May without looking at the men. Can you stand? She nodded under the sack. Come along, he said. He did not take her arm. He did not tug the cloth. He did not act like he owned what he had paid for. He just turned and started toward the mouth of the alley. His boots found the ground like he knew it well. She followed his footsteps. The knot held. They passed the smithy's big doors and the saloon's slatted windows. A piano banged at the far end of the street. The sound carried and thinned in the cold. May heard someone say, "Hood girl," and then nothing else. The wind rose and the street narrowed. Coal smoke turned into pine on the edge of town. At the hitch rail, a dun mare waited head down, breath making white ropes in the air. Eli touched the horse's neck. Juniper, he said. Easy now. He cupped his hands and lifted May by the waist. He did not gasp. He did not grunt. He set her on the saddle the way a farrier sets a shoe positioned and sure. The leather creaked. The girth strap clicked through a buckle. Juniper shifted once and settled. Eli swung up behind. The saddle took his weight with a small groan. He spoke close enough for her to hear and far enough not to press. Name is Eli Thatcher. Hollow Run is west along the birch stands, then up a bit. It is a quiet place. You can lock your door from the inside. You can talk, or you can keep your peace. I do not need a servant. Thank you, she said. Her voice felt like a stone turned over for the first time in months. He did not answer. He clicked his tongue. Juniper stepped into the road, then off it and onto a track along a fence that had lost 2 rails to a hard winter. The sound of town fell away. Birch trunks came in pairs, then in stands, white as bone and black as writing. Wind threaded the trees and made a sound like a bell far off. On the hill above the last lean-to, a chapel sat with its roof patched in tin. A bell hung in its frame, even though the bell was cracked. The wind touched it. It gave a single note, and the note went thin and broke. Juniper's breath came steady. Her ears flicked. Leather rubbed leather. A buckle knocked in time with the horse's steps. May kept her hands at the horn. The burlap brushed her mouth, and the knot pulled once with the rhythm of each step. Near a frozen creek, Eli stopped to give the mare her head. Ice cracked under the horse's hooves and held. He reached into a saddlebag, found a blanket, and held it where May could take it without skin on skin. She took it. Juniper snorted. A crow lifted from the birch tops and went across the pale sky like ink. They climbed a ridge where wind had scraped the snow bare in long streaks. The track bent and dropped toward a narrow valley where smoke lifted from a squat chimney. Hollow Run sat there like it had grown out of stubbornness. The roof had new planks next to old ones. The fence leaned and kept its work anyway. A lantern at the porch cast a warm circle on rough boards. There were tracks everywhere from human feet and hooves and dogs that were not there now. Eli swung down and put a steadying hand on the reins. He looked up at May as if this were a simple thing that needed to be done right. He reached for her not for a grip that would pull, but for a place where his palm could guide, and the rest would be up to her. She let herself slide. Her boots hit the packed earth and held. Inside the room smelled like pine smoke and old leather and stew that had been simmering long enough to settle into itself. The table was plank wood, rubbed smooth by use. A stove ticked as if thinking. Hooks along the wall held a coat a length of rope, a ladle with a dent in its bowl. The wind tried the seams of the door and failed. Eli ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it where she could find it in front of a chair. He set a heel of bread beside it. He put a jar of deer tallow and a folded rough towel at the end of the table. He pointed with his chin down a short hall. Room on the left, lockworks. He pulled a small key from the wall and set it near her reach. It is the only one. She stood with the bowl in her hands, the burlap warm against her face now with steam from the stew. Her fingers shook a little from cold or something else. The knot at her neck stayed hard. She could feel the ropes bite through her hair. The room was quiet enough that a drip somewhere in the sink could be counted. He did not sit. He did not ask questions. He looked at the air over her shoulder like a man giving another person a wide space and guarding its edges. The wind paused. The stove ticked again. Somewhere behind the house, a horse stamped and blew. "Let me," he said. Her hands tightened around the tin. She did not look up. "Just the knot," he said. "In this house only." He came close enough that she could hear that he carried cold on his clothes and smoke in his cuffs. His fingers stopped once in the air, then reached for the rope at the back of her head. He touched the first turn of the knot and found where it crossed itself. His fingertips pressed the hemp. The knot held. The room drew one more breath. Then his thumb slid under the loop. The burlap shifted. The wind found the door and tried it again. Everything waited. The knot gave. The loop slipped under Eli's thumb, and the burlap eased. Air touched the back of her neck. He lifted the sack away and held it in both hands so the cloth would not drag the floor. May blinked into the room's lamplight. Pine smoke had a soft edge that steadied her. The table, the dented ladle, the single key on the plank, all waited as if they had been set out for someone particular. Her face felt strange in the open. She kept her chin leveled at the stove. Eli looked, then looked away, not in recoil, not in pity. He set the burlap on a hook beside the door, folded once. "I need to seal that bottom seam under the jamb," he said. "Draft likes that gap." She held the bowl and spoon and found the stew thicker near the top. Beans and onions, a strip of beef gone tender. Steam touched her cheeks. She ate with small, careful mouthfuls. Bread broke clean in her fingers. Eli poured coffee and sat across from her, not facing straight on, boots angled toward the hearth like a man taking watch at a gate. "Do you ride?" he asked. She nodded, then remembered he could see. "A little." "Snow will close the ridge if it wants to," he said. "If we need to move, you will manage, Juniper." His tone made it a statement, not an order. When the bowls were empty, he lifted his plate, rinsed it at the basin, set it upside down on a towel. "There is a room left," he said again, a shade softer. "Lock works fine. If the wind bothers you, wedge that chair leg under the sill." May took the key and felt its cold against her palm. In the small room she found a bed that gave with a small sigh a peg for a dress, a quilt stitched in squares that did not match, and therefore did. She lay down without taking off her boots, and slept because the house stayed quiet. At first light, the sound of an axe set a rhythm outside. Thock draw thock. The steady lift of it loosened the tight places between her ribs. May folded the quilt, set her boots by the door, and stepped into the kitchen. A strip of canvas lay on the table. Someone had cut it for a body bigger than most. A pair of tailor's shears with maple handles sat on top. A red thread ran in a clean line across the hem and disappeared into a knot at the edge. She touched the thread's knot, rolled it between finger and thumb. She lifted the apron and tied it around her. The fit was exact. Eli came in with a load of wood. Snow crystals glittered on his coat sleeve and melted where they met the warmer room. He glanced once at the apron and then at the gap he had mentioned. He knelt and stuffed cloth in the seam with practiced hands. That should keep the draft honest. May scrubbed the counter with hot water and a rag until the pine showed pale under the wear. She repaired a split spoon handle with a band of cloth and 2 small nails. She washed the stew pot and found where the tin had a thin spot, made a note in her head to move the pot to a cooler edge when the boil started. The house learned her as she learned it. Out at the stable, Juniper hung her head over the gate and snorted a greeting that fogged the air. In the next stall, a chestnut colt shifted his weight and lifted a front foot, as if the ground under him had not decided whether it would hold. Scar tissue made a pale ring above the fetlock. His eye showed white with any sudden sound. Comet Eli said from the door. He kicks when the wind turns and the rafters speak. I have not found a way to say quiet in his language. May crouched so the colt did not have to look down. She set her hand at the neck well ahead of the scar. She breathed in a slow count, then again until her body matched the horse's barrel. He blinked once, then twice. She lifted a rope, set the loop wide, and let him step into it at his own pace. He did not lift the hoof to strike. His shoulder lowered by a fraction, then another. Eli watched with his hands in his coat pockets. The corner of his mouth moved a little, which was as near to a smile as he went in daylight. By late afternoon she had kindling split and stacked, though the first blows of the axe bounced shifted bit where the grain curved away. Her palms burned and would blister by morning. She swallowed the instinct to apologize to the empty yard. When a piece finally cracked clean down the middle, she set both halves in the woodbox and stepped back so she would not look as if she had claimed a victory. In the evening, Eli pulled a small blue cloth book from a shelf and set it on the table without introduction. It was worn at the edges. A square of fabric had been sewn to the cover with stitches, so even they looked like print. Lila kept notes that helped this place run, he said. Recipes when to watch for the thaw, how much salt the well can stand. You do not have to read it. May opened to a page where someone had drawn a small diagram for a wind chime made from tin spoons. Tie them low, the note said, so the sound stays close to the door and does not wake the loft. She turned another page and found a list that paired cold days with the way dough behaved. She closed the book and slid it back. Thank you. A week in May found a new piece of furniture by the kitchen wall. A chair cut from cedar, the seat generous, and the back curved to hold a spine without complaint. The surface shone with oil in a way that promised to keep splinters where they belonged. When she ran her fingers under the seat, she felt rougher grain and found 2 letters burned into the wood. M and H. She traced them once and let the chair stand there like a name card written without ink. Snow came light in the mornings and melted into the ground by noon. On one of those wet nights with the clouds hanging so low the yard felt smaller, May went out to the stable and closed the doors behind her. The smell of hay and horse and old leather rose from the boards. She took off her boots and stood in her socks on the packed earth. She lifted her arms and let her fingers draw lines in the air. No set pattern, only weight and breath and the sound of rain moving along the roof. Her hips learned the order of the space. She let a turn go wider than she would have in a room with mirrors. A hoof scuffed in one of the stalls and a horse sighed. A voice at the door said, "I never learned." She turned. Eli stood with his hat in his hand. His coat darkened where the rain had touched it. There was no judgment in his eyes, only something attentive that did not reach for her. "I am not much of a teacher," she said. "Not like a real one. I do not need a lesson," he said. "Maybe a step, then another." He came forward and stopped with room for air between them. He held out a hand palm up so she could take it or not. She placed her fingers on his. His hand was warm from work. He lifted his other hand only high enough to mark a frame at her shoulder without closing it. He moved his weight to the right and she to the left. The stable roof ticked. The rain slowed and came back again. The green stone at his wrist caught lamplight and let it go. He stepped on her toe once and she laughed without sound. He muttered sorry and she shook her head. The horses settled into their own slow music. The movements said what words could not afford. Days put themselves in an order that felt earned. He left wood by her door when the morning went hard. She left coffee near his seat when his shoulders sat lower than they had at dawn. His questions came in twos and stopped if she did not answer. Do you like cornbread sweet? Do you sleep with the window cracked? He learned to knock with his knuckles on her door frame and wait until she said yes. The thaw showed itself as mud at the crossroads, then as runnel water that spoke against the ditch stones. The town needed flour and nails and a piece of harness leather from Crane's Mercantile. Eli hitched the wagon and set a folded tarp under the bench where she might put her hands if the spring wind turned mean. May sat with her bonnet brim low and her fingers wrung together beneath the canvas like a prayer somebody had forgotten to say aloud. Silver Hollow lay more open without snow. Edges of things appeared that winter had erased. A signboard that had lost one chain. A shutter that slapped when the wind found it. Men leaned on posts, women carried baskets, a dog slept with its head on its front feet, and did not lift it even as the wagon passed. They drew up at the Mercantile. Eli climbed down, and then waited, hand out. She sat frozen for the length of a breath. Her throat tightened with the memory of rope and burlap and breath that did not feel owned. A door across the street opened. A woman looked, then looked again. A whisper moved. Hood girl from a mouth that did not know it spoke aloud. May stepped to climb down. Her boot slid into mud that had gathered where the thaw ran past a rut. The splash reached the hem of her dress and threw brown across the toe of her boot. Heat rose up her neck as if the mud had gone through the leather and into her. She half turned to get back to the seat. Eli went to a knee in the street. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and pulled the boot toward him by the heel so the leather would not twist under her weight. He wiped the mud away with care that belonged in a church. He did not look at the windows or the men by the hitching posts. He spoke at the ground so it would carry, not so it would wound. She is not stock. She is not a price. If you need a name for her use, May Harper. The street quieted as if snow had come again without warning. Someone coughed and then thought better of it. A boy at the pump turned his head and stared at his own reflection in the bucket as if that had been his intention all along. Mrs. Beale fussed with her collar until her fingers had to stop. The dog lifted one ear and put it down. Eli rose, offered his hand in the same way he had in the stable palm, up no pressure. May set her fingers on his and stepped down. She tucked her hand under his arm because the street was slick and because she wanted a solid point in a place that tried to move under her. They went into the Mercantile, and the door's bell rang, one clear note that sounded like it belonged in another town. Silas Crane stood behind the counter, arranging a stack of ledgers that did not need arranging. He had watched the wiping of the boot without changing his face. He waited while Eli asked for flour and nails and harness leather cut to measure. His eyes flicked toward May once and then did not again. The sale took its own time. Coins clicked. Paper tore along a neat line. Eli lifted the sacks into the wagon bed and set the leather over the rail so it would not crease. The town exhaled when the wheels began to turn. Eli kept the pace even, no haste, no hesitation. May's hands loosened under the tarp and stayed there. Back on the road that ran between Birch and Creek, the wind came down and played the bell at the chapel with a touch that was almost kind. The note ran out into the trees and did not break this time. Behind the Mercantile counter, when the door had closed and the street had gone back to its own business, Silas unlocked a small box and took out a folded wire. He read it once, then twice, lips moving without sound. Clarissa Pike, the line said, arriving on the East mail coach, claimed to settle. He smoothed the paper, then folded it on the same crease. He slid it back into its envelope and placed it under the counter next to the ledger ink. He reached and straightened the crooked sign on his wall by a finger's width and left it that way. The days learned a new order. Morning frost lifted by noon. Mud slicked the ruts, then tightened when the clouds closed. May rose before the light cleared and set the fire on its bed of coals. She wiped the counters until the grain showed clean and pale. She hauled water that slopped and froze around the bucket rings. She lifted split wood that stung her palms where the new skin had not settled. If a thing could be done, she did it. Eli came and went with the steady shape of a man who knew the length of the day. He checked a fence line that sagged between posts. He counted bales, then counted again. He noticed when May had moved the stew pot to the cooler edge so it would not burn thin tin. He left wood by her door when the wind sharpened west. He said little, she said less. The quiet stretched without tearing. Work pressed May like the hand of someone who meant well and did not know its own strength. She carried grain across the yard, the sack tight against her ribs. Her breath shortened, and she told herself to keep the next step small. She split kindling until a blister lifted at the base of her thumb, and she did not pause. She bent in the stable, and the world went narrow at the edges. She straightened, and the world returned. By dusk, the light thinned to a color she could taste. Metal on tongue smoke and teeth. She stood in the yard with the grain sack half dragged and half lifted. The ground took her knees. The sack swung away. She heard the chickens speak sharply, and then the sound ran off toward the creek. The yard tilted, then set. Cold licked the back of her neck and stayed. Eli came fast from the lower field. The reins hit the post and bounced once. He ran with his head forward like he meant to lift the earth with his shoulders if it got in the way. He knelt in the mud and rolled May toward him with hands that shook. "May, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved beneath their lids. Her mouth tried a word and found nothing. He pressed his fingers to the side of her neck and counted while he breathed. He scooped her up, not careful because he had time, but careful because he did not. She felt heavier than any weight he had carried because she was the only weight that mattered in that hour. Inside the fire took the kindling with a rush, like someone who had been waiting at a door too long. Eli set May on the bed and put a folded blanket under her knees so the blood would not run away from her face. He poured water into a bowl and found willow bark in a jar on the shelf where Lila had kept it. He worked honey loose with a spoon that had a dent, then let the bark steep until the water turned the color of weak tea. He held the cup to May's mouth and coaxed a swallow, then another. It ran from the corner of her lip and he caught it with a cloth. He moved in the room with the care of someone who knew where nails stuck out. He set a clean towel where he could find it by feel. He folded the rough towel that had seen the day and put it out of reach. He wrung a rag and laid it across her forehead. He spoke her name in the tone people use when they are talking to a skittish horse in a hailstorm. "May, stay with me." Her breath went high and shallow, then dropped and evened, then broke into shivers that climbed her spine. He set a palm at her back and rubbed a slow circle as if he could teach her body a new rhythm. At the far wall, the spoon chime Lila had drawn in a book moved at the touch of wind and tapped a low count. It did not wake the loft. It did keep time. The night lengthened. Eli watched the window lighten and darken where clouds pushed and then opened. He blinked hard when his eyes burned. Once he leaned against the bedstead and forgot to move. He woke with his cheek on the blanket and a pain in his neck. He stood and started again. He said words that had belonged to other rooms in other years. He said "Ma," then bit the name off because it did not belong here. He said "please," and it did. May turned near dawn. Her skin did not burn. Her mouth felt dry and thick, but water made sense again. She opened her eyes, and the room set itself back into its shapes. Stove, chair, the key on the hook, the smell of smoke that had chosen to stay. Eli sat on the floor with his back to the bed and his eyes closed. He rubbed his jaw and it made a rasp. He opened his eyes when her hand moved on the blanket. "Morning," he said, and his voice came rough. No more than that. She tried to sit. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and lifted slowly. A small wooden box sat on the chair within reach of her hand. Birchwood. Edges sanded smooth. The lid carried her name burned with a nail heated in the stove until the metal had gone red. M-A-E, the letters uneven and therefore certain. She lifted the lid and found leather that had been handled long enough to soften, a pair of slippers that curved wide where her foot curved. The toe did not pinch. The seam rose and fell where the stitching had been set by a hand that wanted strength more than display. The sole had been scored with a knife so it would not slide on smooth boards. She could see where Eli had held the leather with his thumb while he stitched. The print of that push showed as a shine near the heel. A scrap of paper lay under the slippers. The writing stood straight and unpracticed. "They told you not to dance. The wind here thinks different." Her hand moved to her mouth of its own accord. Her eyes stung. She placed one slipper on her foot, and the leather took her shape at once. She set both feet on the floor and felt a small lift in her chest that had nothing to do with breath. The spoon chime tapped once. The wind had come in at the eaves and said yes to something. Eli stood with his hands in his pockets like a man not sure where to put them. "You will need grip on the chapel boards," he said. "They are worn slick in places." The words came out short. They were true. She did not ask when he had measured her. She knew. He had eyes that counted and hands that remembered. She set the box on the chair and sat quiet until quiet had done its work. The days after did not rush. The fever left a weakness behind and May let it speak. She took the yard in 2 trips instead of 1. She allowed the water to be less than full. She hummed when she moved a pot so the sound filled the spaces where strength had not yet returned. Eli made a habit of leaving a split log by her door. She made a habit of cracking the window a finger width when the air in the room went still. The house learned her again. One afternoon, when the sun tried the edge of a cloud and found it would hold, Eli came in smelling of wet rope. He nodded toward the door. "The mare stepped light today," he said. "She wants the ridge." May smiled with half her mouth and set a cup on the table where his hand would find it without reaching. They moved in a pattern that felt new and also like something old they had been taught years ago. The thaw deepened. The creek ran and spoke, then swallowed its words under ice near the bend. The chapel bell on the hill took wind like a kind hand. Sometimes it gave a single note that hung and then faded. Sometimes it did not move at all, and the stillness set a boundary around the yard. The knock came when May was on her feet and steady again. It was not a neighbor's tap. It was a sound like someone spelling their name into wood. Firm. Exact. Eli was away with a snare line and the trail beyond the cottonwoods. May set down a bowl and wiped her hands on her apron. The red thread at the hem caught her eye. She touched the knot with her thumb as if to steady it. She opened the door. A woman stood on the porch with a coat that had seen more money than weather. Auburn hair pinned without a loose strand. Gloves without a stain. She stepped past the threshold before the word welcome could be said. The room made her features sharper. She did not soften. "Is Mr. Thatcher at home?" she asked. Her voice placed itself in the center of the room. "My name is Clarissa Pike. I have come regarding my sister." Clarissa stepped farther into the kitchen and let her eyes move over what the house held. The cedar chair with its broad seat. The spoon chime that spoke only when the wind asked gently. The apron cut for a larger body, a red thread bright along the hem. "My sister read poetry before breakfast," she said. Then she reached and touched the deer tallow jar with one gloved finger. "I do not see poetry here." May kept her hands at her sides. The stove breathed. The spoon chime clicked once and went still again. Clarissa's gaze landed on the burlap sack folded on the hook beside the door. Her mouth thinned. "They told me in town," she said. "They said you came with a covering, that it spared folks an offense." She smiled without kindness. That was a mercy for them. May looked past Clarissa's shoulder at the square of cold light where the door stood open an inch. She set her breath in a slow count and let the count finish. Eli came in as if the house had called him by name. His coat was damp along the hem. He took in the room the way men take in a river in spring, with one quick look that finds the current and the broken branch. "Clarissa," he said. "Brother," she said. The word did not fit her mouth. "I have come for Lila's things, and to see what mess you have made in her absence." Eli set his hat on the peg and did not look at the sack on the wall. He did not look at the chair where the letters M and H lay burned into the wood. He looked at Clarissa as if they stood on a street and a cart needed guiding past without a crash. "Lila's notes are where they always were," he said. "You can hold them if you want. The house stays as it is." Clarissa laughed once sharp. The sound struck the spoon chime and made it answer. "You brought a woman into this house who was sold behind a forge. Think what that does to Lila's name. Think what that does to yours." May felt the heat touch her throat. She did not move her hands. Eli's voice lowered by a measure. "Do not." "She has no place here," Clarissa said. "You cannot set a price on a body and call it a wife. You cannot dress that price in a larger apron and pretend you have made a home." Eli took one step closer and set both hands palm down on the table so the wood knew he was grounded. "You do not know this place," he said. "You left when the ground still held frost for half the year. You sent letters when it pleased you. Lila is not replaced. A chair cannot carry two names. May is here because I was not living and she made me remember how." Clarissa opened her mouth and then closed it. Her gaze flicked to May, then away. Her chin lifted as if the air had turned thin. "I will collect what is mine," she said. "Then I will go." She turned and took the blue cloth book from where it sat and held it like something she would return to a shelf in her own rooms. At the door she paused and looked back at Eli. "This will not last." Eli did not answer. Clarissa left her glove print on the doorframe without knowing it and stepped into the yard. The wagon wheels rasped on gravel, then faded. May looked at the apron's red thread and pressed the knot flat with a thumb. She walked to the porch and sat under the awning where the wind could move through without cutting. The yard had a different shape now. The fence leaned more to the left. The ridge stood closer. The bell on the hill did not ring. Eli came and stood 2 steps below her, then knelt and reached for her hand. Not to pull, to hold. "She is wrong," he said. His voice had no iron in it, only weight. "You are not a weight I carry. You are the reason I can." May nodded. Her eyes held water as if the cup had been filled too near the rim. She did not let it spill. Eli stayed where he was and let his hand be steady under hers. That night the house held its breath. The sack on the wall made a square shadow. The spoon chime did not sing. The lamp on the table put a thin circle on the wood and then went out. Before daylight, May dressed by feel. She folded her shawl once and laid it over her arm. She set the slippers in their box and touched the burned letters on the lid. She put the key for her room on the table where the sun would touch it first. She sat and wrote by the last of the Coles letters, careful and plain. "Eli," it said, "I know what I am to your story. A seam over a tear. I am grateful you saw me. I will not be a kindness you feel you owe. Live free of that owing." She set the paper by the blue cloth book that Clarissa had taken, and then sat back. She did not take the apron. She did not take the slippers. She lifted the latch on the door and stepped into a yard that smelled like rain that had not started. By the time the first drops found the porch, May had crossed the lower field. Her boots sank where the ground lost itself and found itself again. The birches took the wind and let it go. The chapel sat on its hill with the tin patch on its roof, and the cracked bell that did or did not ring, depending on what the wind wanted. The door stood ajar. She went inside and sank to the floor near the back pew, where the boards still held a little warmth from someone's hand earlier in the day. At Hollow Run, Eli woke to a room that did not contain May's breath. The chair by the wall where the slippers had been sat empty as if it had been made for such a moment. He found the note. The coal grit on the paper told him she had written in the dark. The words told him more than he wanted to know. He did not call her name because names in empty rooms make a sound a person cannot bear. He took his coat and hat. He went to the barn, and Juniper lifted her head as if she had been waiting for this. He threw the saddle in hands that never shook. The cinch held on the second pull. He swung up and put his heel in the mare's side, and the horse took the yard in 3 strides, and the road in 5, and the field in a line that did not question fences. Rain came in a sheet and then in lines. It struck his face, and he let it. Mud lifted and wore the shape of hoof prints and then lost it. The birches gave him a last sight of the house when he turned, and then they took it away. The chapel rose out of the weather like it had been held low and then allowed to stand. The door gave under his hand with a sound that was half hinge and half breath. The inside smelled like old wood that had spent years listening and like damp stone. May sat curled with her knees to her chest and her shawl tight around her. She did not start when he came in. She lifted her face, and the light from the open door found the wet on her skin. Eli closed the door until the wind was a voice on the other side. He set what he carried on the nearest intact pew. He had taken the sack from the hook at home and folded it flat. He ran his hand over it once to smooth a crease that his hand had made. He picked it up and held it where May could see it. "I kept this," he said. "Not to remember the alley and the men and the cold that bit through cloth. To remember what was put on you by a world that chose not to see. I will not forget it, because forgetting is a kind of letting it happen again." He set the sack on the floor between them in a careful square. "I do not want to see it on you ever again." May watched his hands. She watched the way he made the cloth a shape that would not reach for her by accident. Her throat worked once. She nodded once small. Eli reached into his coat pocket and brought out a length of braided leather. The braid had been set tight by a hand that had learned patience. A green stone sat in the middle where the 3 strands met. The stone was not perfect. It held a fracture that caught light and sent it into the leather and back. He went to his knees on the chapel floor. His boots creaked. His breath stood in front of him, and then it did not. "I first saw you with a sack on your head," he said. "That is the worst thing about me, I know. That I stood in a place where that could be done, and others laughed, and I did not stop the world that day. I could only take you away from it. I have watched you stand since. I have watched you hold your ground while wind pushed and people looked. I have watched you breathe when breathing cost. I have watched you dance when no one gave you a reason to." His hand shook once and then steadied. "I have been unburied by that." He lifted the braid and set it in both palms. "No sack," he said. "No crowd, no fear. Will you marry me, May Harper?" The bell on the hill took a small piece of wind and gave a sound that did not carry far. The rain beat against the tin and lost some of its will. The spoon chime at Hollow Run might have moved at that same moment, or it might not have. The chapel held the space where 2 people knelt, and the sack lay on the floor in a square that would not change its shape unless someone changed it. The room waited. May's answer came quiet and certain. "Yes." Eli let out the breath he had been holding without knowing it. He lifted the braid. His fingers moved with the patience of a man tying a halter in bad weather. He looped the leather around her ring finger and set a small knot that would hold and not bite. The green stone rested against her skin and took a little of the chapel's light. Somewhere above, a drop found its way through tin and landed with a soft tick that sounded like agreement. They rose together. The sack lay on the floor as a square that meant what it meant and would not be made into anything else again. Eli picked it up and folded it twice. He set it on the rear pew where the light did not reach. May touched his knuckles with 2 fingers and then let her hand fall. Between them the air felt wider. Morning brought a clean chill. They swept the chapel with straw brooms Hattie Bloom had brought in her wagon. The dust lifted and then settled. Old Mose came with his hat held gentle as if it were a fledgling. He smelled like horse and wet earth. Reverend Amos Ward arrived with a book whose cover had gone smooth from use, and a face that chose hope, even in rain. Juniper cropped grass by the fence and lifted her head when the bell gave a small sound that was more breath than tone. May wore a white dress stitched from homespun that had been cut true and sewn steady. The seams did not flaunt themselves. They carried their duty without comment. On her feet were the slippers Eli had made. The leather had already learned her way of standing. Eli's coat was brushed and held its shape at the shoulders. He had washed in Cold Creek water and combed his hair back with his hands, so it stayed not because of oil, but because the hair knew what he wanted. The service did not linger. Reverend Ward spoke the words the town knew. He asked the questions that needed answers, and no more. Old Mose cleared his throat and stood as witness boots planted on the boards that remembered other vows. Hattie set a small cake on a crate and covered it with a square of muslin as if it were something alive that needed quiet. Eli took May's hands. His thumbs went still against her fingers. "I bind myself to you," he said, and the word bind sat clean because it had been chosen. May looked into his face and the chapel showed itself inside his eyes. "I bind myself to you," she said, and the green stone brightened as if it had heard. They kissed without spectacle. It was not a taking. It was a thanks. When they drew back, the bell gave one clear note carried by a kind wind. Reverend Ward smiled in a way that made his cheeks lift. Hattie dabbed at her eye with the corner of her shawl and pretended she had only been checking a thread. Old Mose coughed and looked at the rafters. They ate slices of cake that held more sugar than the winter had given, and tasted like a day that would last. Eli cut the first piece so the crumb would not crush. May laughed when the frosting touched his thumb, and he looked surprised at the sweetness. Juniper snorted like a guest who understood ceremony and wanted a return to work. Evening fell without hurry. Eli lit a lantern and hung it from a beam that had seen storms but kept standing. The circle of light warmed the floorboards and called them to the center of the room. They moved toward each other without consulting words. He offered his hand. She placed hers on his. The other hand marked a frame that did not cage, only guided. They danced on the worn boards in small steps that learned the space as they went. The lantern swung and made the shadows breathe. The bell stayed quiet. Their feet made a rhythm that did not need a song. He stepped wrong once and corrected. She missed a count and found it. Their bodies spoke in sentences that were only theirs. Outside, the wind traveled the ridge and left the chapel a small calm. Later, they walked back to Hollow Run under a sky where the rain had washed the stars clean. The spoon chime by the door answered so softly that they felt it in their chests rather than heard it. The house held 2 sets of footsteps that moved with the ease of belonging. The cedar chair with M and H burned beneath waited by the wall. May set the slippers by the door where morning would find them. Eli hung his coat and smoothed the fold once, as if to honor the day. Time found them and seated them side by side at the table and also across from each other, where the fire's light could show their faces. Work did not change its shape because of vows. Fences still leaned and needed righting. A colt still watched the rafters when wind spoke through them. The difference was smaller than a change of weather and larger than the ridge. 2 cups instead of 1. A shared glance that set a plan with no words. A hand on a sleeve when the air thinned at the edge of a memory. The spoon chime kept its gentle count. Spring pushed on the hills and opened the birch buds. The chapel door needed paint. The back room where a storage bin had once held hymnals that had crumbled let in a mid-morning beam that landed in a square on the floor. May swept that room until the pine showed through. She scattered rosin until the dust softened the board grain. She set a sign outside the small door, burned with a hot nail just as Eli had burned her name into the box. Let the wind teach. The first to come was a girl with one shoulder higher than the other. Her eyes did not know where to rest. May showed her how to stand with both feet claiming the ground. She did not talk about grace. She showed hands how to reach and return. She tied a ribbon in the girl's hair and left the knot loose enough to let the scalp breathe. The ribbon fell once, and May tied it again with a small smile that said falling did not write the ending. More girls came. A pair of sisters who kept their eyes on each other as if they feared the room would split them. A child who stuttered when words were needed and did not when the body spoke. A teenager who had been told her ankle was too thick and discovered that it held a turn steady as a fence post. They practiced to the sound of the bell when wind agreed and to the sound of their own breaths when it did not. Eli fixed a window catch so the light could come and go without fighting the frame. He set a hook in the corner by request. On that hook, May hung the burlap sack, clean, folded. The rope removed and kept in a drawer as a length of cord without job or threat. Some days she did not look at the sack at all. Some days her eyes went there for the briefest part of a breath. It stayed as a relic that had been made gentle by the hands that decided its use. No one touched it unless May lifted it down and told its story, and even then she spoke of wind and knots, and the way a person stands in a room that once held only boards and dust. Silver Hollow altered by increments. Men who leaned on posts when the wagon passed set their boots together and made room. Mrs. Beale nodded on the street and asked after the weather, which was her way of asking if a person was eating and sleeping. Silas Crane wrapped purchases in brown paper as neat as his account columns and looked people in the eye when he said the name May. Old Mose tipped his hat to the chapel as he rode by. Reverend Ward ran a hand over the bell rope and did not ring it unless the day demanded. Clarissa returned once and came to the chapel door, but did not cross it. She stood where sun cut a line across the threshold and looked at the room that had been made from boards and breath. Her eyes lit on the sack and then on the girls. She left without words. The dust in the beam hung in the air like a slowed snowfall and then settled. At Hollow Run, the chair with M and H stayed near the table. The apron with the red thread hung on its peg and saw use that did not apologize. The green stone at May's finger took firelight and creek light and light from a lamp set low so the room could rest. Sometimes the spoon chime kept time to a song that only their feet knew. Sometimes it did not need to, and the house kept its own steady count. One evening, May locked the studio and crossed the yard with Rosen on her feet that made pale marks that would brush away. She found Eli at the fence wire in his hands, the last of the day on his face. She stepped onto the lower rail and leaned her shoulder against his. Juniper flicked an ear and pressed her soft nose against May's palm. The ridge held its shape. The wind ran through the birches and came down to the chapel and lifted the bell and set it still. May looked at the sign over the studio door and then at the square of folded burlap in the corner inside. Her chest rose and fell in an easy rhythm. Eli tied off the fence wire with a firm twist and clipped the end. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took hers. Their fingers laced without thought. The knot did not bind. It held. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.